So welcome so much to this webinar. We'll be talking about how you can build stronger nonprofit boards to increase your capacity to maximize impact. As Kerri and I were talking in the pre-meeting, we know there's a lot going on in the nonprofit community these days, a lot of uncertainty, but your mission is still vitally important to our country. The work that you do is needed as much as it was today as it was 3 weeks ago. And we want to make sure that we can help you control everything you possibly can control to continue to grow and expand your great work. I'm Sherry Chaney-Jones. I'm the founder and CEO of Sure Impact. Sure Impact's an online cloud platform that helps nonprofits track, measure, and communicate their impact. But beyond being a tech founder, my passion and all that I do really stems from helping nonprofits use data to solve complex social problems and helping you build strong, cohesive, successful nonprofit organizations. And how I do that just happens to be through technology and data, but that's just one piece of the puzzle. So we love to bring together other experts and consultants that strengthen nonprofits as well. And that's what we're doing today. I'm really excited to introduce Kerri Mollard. Before I do that, though, just some quick housekeeping. Please feel free to put any questions that you have in the chat. And Laurel will be monitoring those. She'll interrupt us if there's something like really pressing, but we will have a larger Q&A session at the end. But if you have any questions, comments, thoughts, feel free to interact in the chat that way. We would love to know who you are, where you're calling in from, and keep this engaging as we go through this conversation, because today is definitely more of an interview Q&A style than a lecture. But we will have you all on mute just to minimize background noise and make sure everyone has great quality. This will be recorded and the slides will be available to those later, as well as some resources. So let's go ahead and get in it. And it's my privilege to introduce to you, truly she is my friend, but also a colleague I respect and admire significantly, Kerri Mollard. She has been consulting with nonprofits as long as I've known her, which is more than 20 years, but helping thousands of organizations become more effective and efficient. And I know you're going to be blessed by this conversation. So Kerri, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for the invitation. It's so wonderful to spend time with you. And yes, everybody, we are dear friends, but also I respect Sherry immensely as the entrepreneur and leader and innovator that she is. So happy to be with all of you.
Great, thank you. So our theme of our conversation is today around building stronger nonprofit boards. I know we were having a chat several months ago, and you were telling me about the work you were doing with board of directors and just how important that is for our nonprofits. Whether I should have asked people, and I'm going to ask them to do this now because I didn't ask in the intro, but I would love to know if are you an executive leader or a board member? Feel free to throw that in the chat because I'm sure, if you are an executive leader, this is great information to help bring back to your board and strengthen your board. And of course, if you also are a board member, to improve the work that you're doing as well. So thank you for sharing that with us as well. So Kerri, what does a strong board look like to you when we talk about strong boards?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I'm going to start with this quote. So for everybody that's on the webinar, if you're not familiar with BoardSource, BoardSource is the international leader in nonprofit board governance. They're based in Washington, D.C. I've been trained and received a credential from BoardSource, and I'm proud to say that I'm part of an invitation-only group of consultants who partner with them. So we often go to them for their thought leadership. But this quote answers your question, Sherry, right? What does an impactful board look like? Well, first of all, it's about composition, right? The single most important relationship in a nonprofit organization is the relationship between the board and the chief executive. And the second most important relationship is among board members themselves. So to be able to have those positive relationships, you got to think about the composition. And so we love this quote because the board's composition absolutely impacts how it leads. And then the composition should be a reflection of the organization's values. And so a really, high performing, high impact board to us has the right people in the seats serving the organization. The expectations of their service are clear. They understand their roles and responsibilities. They honor the organization's mission, vision, and values, and they use those things in decision making. And when you have the composition right, you have the right people, and relationships are tended to, decisions are made based on mission, vision, and values, you can move mountains, right? When those things are fractured or broken, or, if anyone on this webinar says, yeah, well, 20% of our board is good and 80% are kind of checked out. Well, you take the very hard work that you're doing, which can feel like pushing a boulder uphill, and you make it exponentially harder. And so when the board is the right people and they're all aligned in rowing in the same direction and supporting each other, and the chief executive, you can move mountains. So that's how I would answer it. Is a strong board has got the right people with clear expectations and a focus on impact and mission.
Awesome. I'm sure we all would aspire to have that. So we'll talk a little bit more about how, as executive leaders, we can achieve that, and or how we can invite the right people to join our boards as well. Now, in kind of in lieu of Beth Casey's question that she posted, which is definitely what we'll be talking about, related to how do we balance that? What are the roles and responsibilities of the board versus kind of getting that, we don't want them in the nitty gritty, but we want to be helpful. So I think that's probably a great place to start, is related to what are the essential board roles and responsibilities, just so we have a level set of this is the work of the board and this is the work of everybody else.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to refer to Board Source. And for the folks in the webinar, I'm going to go through this list relatively quickly, but again, put questions in the chat. This list is from Board Source. There's a numerical order. There's kind of a method to the madness, and I'll explain it. But if I were to ask everybody on the webinar, if we had the time to say, what do you think is the most important role and responsibility of a board? I'm going to venture to guess you're going to say financial oversight. You're going to say, legal and ethical accountability. You're going to say, strategic planning. But really, number one is mission. And it is everything. And so for those of you on this call, think about your organization's mission statement. Is it concise? Is it clear? Is it compelling? Is it a statement of why you do what you do? Or is it this like paragraph long litany of what you do? If you have that paragraph long litany of what you do, first homework assignment is rewrite your mission statement. When you have a clear, compelling mission statement, less than 13 words, by the way, that can help clarify and define everything in the organization, from planning to board governance to fundraising. So the board's number one role is being a guardian of the mission, being clear on the organization's purpose, making sure the organization is constantly going toward that North Star, and related to mission is vision and values. And again, very quickly, vision should not be to be the best human service agency in the region. Vision should never be organization centric. It should always be about impact. It should always be about the people and places that you serve. If you're successful at fulfilling your mission day in and day out, what is the impact on them? The work that Sherry and her team does. When you can get clear on their impact, that's your North Star. So mission, vision, and values is number one. The board is the guardian of that mission. If any of you on the call are a founder of the organization, often founders feel like they own mission and vision because it was their idea to get the nonprofit started. It's really owned by the board. Setting strategic direction is a fundamental responsibility of board governance. The next two are related. I touched on this with Sherry's first question about what does an impactful board look like? Well, again, the most important relationship is between a board and its chief executive. So number two, the board chooses the chief executive. And number three, the board supports and evaluates that person. And if any of you on this call are a chief executive and you don't get a regular annual performance review, that should be something that your board should be doing on a regular basis. And for all the chief executives on this call, define what support means to you. We often find miscommunication when board members think they're being supportive, but it's not what the chief executive needs. So number one, why do we exist? Number two, who's going to lead us? Number three, does that leader have what they need to be successful? And then four, okay, then what's our plan? How are we going to achieve our mission? What are our goals? What are the outcomes that we're trying to achieve? And number five is then monitor and strengthen programs and services. And this is where data comes in. How, as a board, do you know if, in fact, the mission's being fulfilled? How do you know? If the only data that a board is looking at is, the financial statement, the balance sheet, census count data, which is we call, just the tracking of how many people attended a program or how many people came through the facility, that kind of just activity count or census count, it's a measure. It's good to know how many people attended a program, but does that tell you if the mission's being fulfilled? Does that tell you if people's lives are being changed? Are outcomes being achieved? Is there a change in life condition, knowledge, skill? So chief executives, board members, number five is critically important. And any of our clients who take number five seriously and really come up with good outcomes measures and track them, report them, and analyze them, again, they can move mountains because they have very clear data. And any board that's just looking at the financial income statement and the balance sheet and some census data, they don't really know. You can't make good decisions. So Sherry, I'll ask you this question. There's 10 of these. What is missing in this first five?
Oh, geez, you're putting me on the spot here.
Yeah, quick pop quiz to Sherry. What do you see is missing in the first five?
Maybe culture.
Culture, also money, right?
Yes.
And it's not, but it's number six. And the reason it's number six, and I will, Sherry, I'll tell you and for everybody, board members will push back at me on this all the time. And they'll say, Kerri, that's crazy. You can't do the first five without money. And our response is, good luck raising money if you don't have the first five, right? If you don't have a clear mission, if you don't have a strong leader who is supported and ready to go, you don't have a plan and you don't have data, you might succeed at a golf outing, but you're not going to be raising money in a substantial or sustainable way. So that's why it's number six. It's first things first. Number six means the board should be supporting the chief executive and the staff on raising money. It also means every board member writes a check. And so for those of you on the call, if you don't have 100% participation in board member giving, and it's not okay if the company that the board member represents gives a loan, no, every board member has to write a check. Again, that'll be homework assignment number 2, is to dive into that. It's very difficult to go out to external funders and say, hey, support this mission and this impact if those closest to the mission on your board aren't writing a check. So number 6 is raising it. And then number 7 is that financial oversight. Typically boards do number 7 very well. Typically board members understand that critical role of oversight and fiduciary. Typically boards do number 6 very, very poorly. Then it's build and sustain a competent board. Board members, it's on you to perpetuate your board. It's not the responsibility of the chief executive to be out there constantly recruiting. That's a recipe for disaster. And then we joke that number 9 is stay out of jail, right? That's legal and ethical integrity, making sure that all things compliance are taken care of. And number 10 is being that ambassador. So if any board members are on this call, we recommend that you don't serve on more than 2 boards. Unless you're retired and you have ample time, it's hard to do all 10 of these and serve on multiple boards. And for the chief executives and the staff who are on this call, if you haven't gone through this list with your board, I highly recommend going through this and having conversations. You can take each one of these 10 items and dive into them and talk about what do these mean at your organization. We also know that organizations are dynamic, right? Life is not linear. And so if you are in a financial crisis, number 7 becomes number 1. If your CEO resigns tomorrow, number 2 becomes number 1. So there's an ebb and a flow as an organization evolves. But again, the order is first things first. So Sherry, I hope I was able to do that quick enough to give everyone a good sense.
Yeah, I think this is a really great framework. And thank you to you and BoardSource for sharing it as it's something that if I were sitting as the executive or president of a board, I could see bringing this to a meeting and having really meaningful discussions, like you mentioned. What does this mean to me? But I imagine that there are some executive leaders or even board chairs on this call who are like, Kerri, this is great, textbook idea, perfect idealistic thinking, but we have 800 things to do right now. So
Yeah.
how can boards get to what you've described? Like, how do we help them build their capacity so this is their reality?
Yeah. And it's real, right? We can't be Pollyanna. There are 800 things that nonprofit chief executives have to do. And right now we're all operating in this larger macro context of American life that is very unpredictable and at moments chaotic. And all of that is real, right? But again, the single most important relationship in any nonprofit organization is the relationship between the board and the chief executive. The second most important relationship is among board members themselves. If there's any dysfunction on your board, if there's a lack of clarity, if there's miscommunication, or if there's been missteps, you got to solve it first. Governance is everything. And when governance is working well, all those 800 things that you have to do, you go. When governance is broken and there's a fracture in those relationships or in the communication, you can't go. You're stuck in whose decision is it, and what about this and what about that? It is wasted energy. And I don't know a single nonprofit CEO who has energy to waste or time to waste. We just I was so proud. We've been working with this client since 2019, and we just did their board retreat again on Saturday. And it's a grant making organization, and the chief executive showed these bar graphs of how much they've raised over time and how much grant making they've given out over time. And the little bars, kind of go up and down. But starting in 2019, when they started to invest in board governance, the bars went off the chart. Now there was a little dip with COVID, right? But they're on this trajectory of raising record levels, granting record levels, because they've invested in the board and that relationship with the chief executive. It really, again, from a data standpoint, Sherry, it was like, oh my God, how do we show this to others? Doing board retreats, attending webinars like today, taking time out of board meetings to dive into strategic conversations like this will all pay dividends.
Yeah, that's so much. It's such great advice, and I love that story you shared about the realities of when boards take the time. If it's, I heard you say you scheduled, the retreat was on a Saturday, and sometimes that's when we have to do it. And as a former consultant who also facilitated board retreats, they give me the call and say it's on Saturday morning, and I'm like, I'll give up my Saturday to help you guys because it's so important. It's such important work. Of course, I'm biased to point number 5 because at Sure Impact, we're all about impact measures. But it does become your roadmap. It makes it very clear, at least from our experience, that when boards have all kind of identified, this is how we define our outcomes. This is how we define success, that now they can kind of, all that chatter that sometimes happens, it goes away. Because we don't have to speculate. We don't have to hypothesize. It's like, no, we're either on track or off track, and now we can figure out how to get back on track. So it does become such a roadmap. And of course, I can tell tons of stories, but I would love from the board's perspective, what are you seeing when your clients have data? And how does understanding one's impact really do help with the other point, which was right below it, and that was fundraising?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, 100%. Oh, and Sherry, before I dive into that, for the folks in the webinar, we do have a little handout that summarizes those board roles and responsibilities. Laura will put it in the chat so you can download that PDF. But yes, how does doing this impact everything? Well, first of all, you make the board and the chief executive make better decisions, right? Mm-hmm. there's not a nonprofit in existence that has ample time, money, and people, right? But so how do you make good decisions on the time, money, and people that you have? And that's with data. But how does it impact it? How does number 5 impact number 6 with the fundraising? It's everything. It's why fundraising is number 6. You got to have the first 5 to successfully raise money. So some of the folks on this call might know about Penelope Burke, and I know Sherry, you know her work. She's a social science researcher. She studies donor behavior. She's studied donor behavior over decades. She has a book called Donor-Centered Fundraising. So if anybody on here would like to get that, or just go on her blog. But all of the decades that she has studied donor behavior, there's 3 things that donors want, just 3 things. Number 1, they want a meaningful thank you letter, right? Not just a form letter. They want it to be well written. They want their name spelled right. They want the letter to come in a timely way. So they want that thank you letter to be an authentic expression of gratitude. Pretty simple, right? Number 2, they want their gift to be designated in some way. They don't have to do like a permanent restriction. They just don't really care about paying for the light bill, right? Every nonprofit wants to raise general operating support, but donors want to know that they're helping to advance the programs and the mission. So they want their gift designated in some way. And then number 3, they want to be told the impact of their gift before they're asked again. So if you are only tracking the transactional census count kind of data, 800 people came through the program in 2024, how does that convey to that donor impact? That conveys a metric, that conveys it's a data point. But out of those 800 people who came through your program in 2024, how many of them now have a better job, or their family's more stable, or their lives are better, or their knowledge has increased? Like, what is the thing that happened to them? Donors demand to know. They don't demand. They say, if I'm going to give again, tell me about the impact. And so it is absolutely related to fundraising success. And in Penelope Burke's research, if donors get those 3 things, a timely, well-written, authentic expression of thank you, that their gift was designated in some way, and they're told the impact of the gift before they're asked again, not only would those donors give again, they would give more. And then, Sherry, you'll love this one. They would give indefinitely.
Wow.
So
Wow.
I don't know a single nonprofit leader would not want their donors to give more and to give indefinitely. And those are the only 3 things that they want. They don't want their name on a building. They don't want, right? Like, they don't want the free t-shirt or the mug or the blah, blah, blah. They want to know that their philanthropy is having an impact.
Yeah.
And if your organization is not measuring impact, it's really hard to convey that to the most important people, which are the people. And I'll share one more thing. It's not just individual donors. When I say people, that isn't just individual donors. It's also institutional donors, because institutional donors are made up of what? People, right? The foundation program manager at ABC Foundation is a person, right? The director of policy at ABC government agency that makes grants is a person. So please don't think that that's just for individual donors.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and what we've seen, and I'm sure you've seen it too, is that, you can develop a great relationship with a program officer and think, I've got a wonderful relationship with them. And this grant, I've got it in the bag. But then if you understand the way grant making typically works, that program officer then has to go pitch your grant to some sort of finance committee or some.
That's right.
And so that committee then starts asking the hard questions. Well, what's their impact? How do they measure success? And if that grant officer can say that on your behalf, smooth sailing.
That's right.
Can't answer those questions. They don't have that personal relationship with you.
That's right.
So it's so important to have both, but let's kind of get, I'm going to ask you one question. It's not necessarily on your list, but I'm really curious about what you've seen or the resistance that you've had or you've seen, because, that's what Sure Impact does. We help
Yeah.
nonprofits have access to real-time outcomes and impact data so they can tell that story and tell donors, thank you for their gift and this is the impact you've made. But so many boards are resistant to maybe the investment or the extra expense. So if you could just share a little bit about how you can overcome that resistance. Obviously, there's a
Yeah,
clear ROI there. You've got stories of ROI. We have stories of ROI.
totally.
Just any thoughts or advice that you have around that?
Yeah. So the first thing is, I would say go to at your next board meeting to all the folks here, say at the top of your agenda, does everyone in this room, can they answer these two questions? Question number one, how do we define success? Question number two, how do we measure success? Just pose those two questions. If everyone in that room can't answer those two questions, that's a massive problem. How does your development director go out and do solicitations? How does your grant writer write a proposal? How does your chief operating officer manage the programs and the staffing? How do you do anything if you cannot first define success and then to measure success?
Yeah.
And there are for-profit businesses who can operate well and grow without defining and measuring success. So pose that at your board meeting. And if you don't have a universal answer of how you do, how you define and how you measure, there's your case for support. You have to solve for it.
Yeah.
And the ROI is real. And I'm not just saying that because my dear friend Sherry is here. Like, whether or not Sherry was on this call, I would be telling you all this very thing. Every board training and board retreat we go through, when we get to that number 5 on that list, which is monitor and strengthen programs and services, we say to the board, how are you doing that now? What data is telling you if your programs and services are having the outcome that they intend, that they're fulfilling your mission and they're helping you realize your vision?
Yeah.
So Sherry, it's just pose that question. And if you don't get uniform answers, you
Yeah.
gotta.
Yeah. And I would also add one more thing and just dig a little deeper about what it's taking your staff to get,
Yeah.
if you do have those answers, because you may find out that it is painstakingly complicated
Yes.
and takes a lot of time and it's difficult. And so
right.
think about, are there better solutions to help?
Yeah, every program area has their own spreadsheet, and then this area has to report to AmeriCorps, and this area has to report to United Way. And the opportunity cost. If you have staff members who are manually doing things in Excel and tracking things and doing multiple entry points and multiple grant systems, again, you don't have the time, people, and money to waste. And that is just a highly inefficient way to do it. It's a way to do it.
Yeah.
It's just it's not a strategic way to do it.
Yeah. Well, the good news is about this audience, at least I see a lot of people on this call who I do know are using Sure Impact. They are Sure Impact customers. Yes,
Right.
which is amazing. So I know they can go into their dashboards with their board in real time and define those two things. This is how we measure success, and this is how we prove it. So let's now talk about fundraising, because we have we're going to say we've got our data, we can now fundraise. So what metrics should I be using when we talk about fundraising?
Yeah. So there's 2 really critical ones, and then there's another one that is like right up there, almost as critical. But the 2 most critical are donor retention rate and average gift size. So for the folks on the call, I wish I could see all of you to see a raise of hands, but how many of you know what your donor retention rate is, number 1? And how many of you know what your average gift size is? And you might say, oh, my development director knows that, or I don't know. But every board member, every chief executive should be able to answer, what is our organizational donor retention rate and what is our average gift size? And why does that matter? Number 1, donor retention rate is not just number to number. So last year we had 100 donors. This year we have 90 donors. We have a 90% retention rate. No. So it's not that simple math. it's still simple, but it's not the number of donors, it's the people. Last year, these people gave to us, or companies or foundations or government entities gave to us. Of those people who gave to us last year, how many of them, the same people, gave this year? That's donor retention. That's year over year. You all might be shocked when you run those calculations that your donor retention is 40%, which means you're losing 60% of your donors year over year. So talk about inefficient, talk about exhausting, talk about burnout. So when a board or a finance committee or the board treasurer or the chair of the development committee says, hey, development team, last year you raised $50,000. This year, let's have you raise 60,000. That's not a growth in 10 grand. That isn't going 50 to 60. It's going 50. And then how many are you going to lose through attrition? And then you got to raise the money to get back to 50 before you can even get to 60. And so when boards really understand donor retention, light bulbs go off, goal setting and budgeting is better, and then boards can dive into helping you engage donors to get your retention rate up. I want all of you to have north of 50%. I want your major donors to be 80, 90% retained. I want your mid-tier donors to be 60 to 70% retained. Little $25 gift donors, those are going to be below 50%. They're many times they're just one-off gifts. But donor retention rate, average gift size, why do you need to know average gift size? Well, if you raised 50 last year, you have to get to 60 this year. You got to make up for how much you're losing in attrition. But then the question is, well, how many donors will it take to make up for the attrition and get to 60? The only way to know how many donors that'll take is average gift size. If your average gift size is $700, it may only be 50 donors to get you there. If your average gift size is $50, it may be hundreds of donors. And again, light bulbs go off when board members see that, like, oh, wow, we need to find 382 people to give us $75. Can we do that? So donor retention rate is the average gift size. And then the third one kind of over here is a measure from Board Source called the dependency quotient. And that is a calculation of how dependent is your organization on your 5 largest sources of revenue.
Wow.
Yeah. And that is often shocking to boards.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'm curious, when you look at that average donor gift size, do you include individual donors, or should you include sources of funding like, grants and other things?
Yeah, so break it out. So do an average gift size for foundations, do an average gift size for government grants or contracts, right? Do an average gift size for individuals. If you have a lot of individuals, you can break it out. What's the average gift size for major gifts versus lower level, and donor retention for those, but to get started, do it globally. What is your global number? And then break it out into type of donor or size of donor to get more sophisticated.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think the lowest we ever had with a client was like a 26 donor retention rate. So 26%. So it means they're losing 74%.
A lot of work. It's probably why we're seeing so much transition in the turnover in development staff too.
Yeah. Well, I fundamentally believe we call it, unrealistic expectations. The finance chair or the CFO says to the development team, hey, you have to raise 10% more than last year, or whatever. They just pick a number, or it's filling a budget gap, but nobody's done the math to find out actually if it's feasible. And then the development director works as hard as they can, but they got to find 74% new donors just to get back to what they raised last year, never mind raise more.
Yeah.
And I truly believe that is one of the reasons we lose so many development directors.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we talked earlier that you've seen like 200% growth in your work with boards over the last year, which is amazing. And it sounds like what you're providing a lot of value. So what trends are you seeing now? And really, what is surprising you most as you're doing these trainings?
Yeah, I think that the trend that we're seeing is more organizations wanting to invest in this very conversation into board governance. Our hypothesis, and we're not totally sure if this is true, but our hypothesis is coming out of post-COVID,
Mhm.
post, the acute COVID in 2021 and 22, where every nonprofit was figuring out how to function.
Mhm.
Starting in 23, our sense is post-COVID organizations are saying we can't go back to how the board was before.
Mhm.
We need a new normal. We need a highly engaged board. We can't afford to have 80% of the board disengaged and checked out. We can't afford to have, a handful of board members who are micromanaging and getting in the weeds of operations. We can't afford to have board meetings where nobody shows up and there's never a quorum. So I truly believe that the trend for why more organizations are investing in board governance is they want a new normal.
Mhm.
um, Navigating the complexities of nonprofit management, especially in this current environment,
Mhm.
is complex.
Yeah.
And they've got to have a board that's in alignment. So I do think that's what's driving it. One of the things that surprises me every time we do a training or a retreat is when we talk about things like executive committees.
Mhm.
Executive committees are no longer considered best practice.
Mhm.
And so many organizations still function with an executive committee that sometimes meets more often than the full board, makes decisions, and that's not best practice anymore. I'm still surprised how many nonprofit boards don't have term limits. It is shocking to me. So things like executive committees and term limits often surprise the boards that we're serving because it's not the conventional wisdom that they've been operating under.
Yeah.
But there's real reasons to think through those things.
Yeah. Daniel just asked the question that I was thinking about. Why are they no longer considered best practice?
Yeah, a couple of reasons. What happens is a power dynamic comes into play. An executive committee becomes a board within a board. So the executive committee has all the conversations, makes decisions, and yes, they go back to the full board and inform the full board. This is what we discussed. Now we need the full board to vote. And then the non-executive committee members are like, well, what am I doing here? What's my point? So you want to avoid the board within a board power dynamic. If any client that comes to us and says, I have a board that's not engaged, the first thing I ask is, do you have an executive committee? Then the second thing I ask is, do you have term limits? When you don't have term limits and you get folks who just hang on for a long time, that also creates a power dynamic, right?
Yeah.
And often we call it holding court in board meetings because they like to talk, right? I've been on this board for 20 years. Let me tell you, and we tried that in 1987. Like,
Yeah.
oh, for God's sakes, right? And then the new board members who come in, they're like, okay, I understand the dynamic here, and I'm not really wanted or needed. And so executive committees and lack of term limits create major engagement issues. Um, Sometimes the executive committees are not making decisions, and so they defend their role. But, we all know there's reality and there's perception.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's the perception that decisions are being made, or the perception that certain board members are more in the know than others. And that can be just as detrimental.
Yeah, that's amazing. And we've got some questions in the chat, which we're going to get to really, really quickly. I do want to before I dive into the Q&A, I'm just curious because I know you have a lot of great resources for our
Yeah.
listeners here. So if you wouldn't mind sharing, and then we'll jump back into some other questions. But what books or thought leaders or resources do you want to make sure that everyone on this call has access to and
Yeah. Let
dive into?
me click over here. So Board Source, of course, an easy website, right? Just boardsource.org. They have a ton of free content, infographics that you can download and share with your board. And then there's things that you have to pay for, but the costs are pretty nominal. So go to Board Source. Number two, we are huge fans of Peter Drucker. Just about anything he's written related to the nonprofit sector is is worth reading, but in particular, his book called The 5 Most Important Questions. There was an updated version in 2015. This one has a white cover. The one prior had a yellow cover. So you want the white cover one. It's like 12, 14 bucks on Amazon, cheap. Buy it for every single board member and go through each of the 5 questions. I promise you, it will be the most rich discussion your board has ever had. And then sign up for our e-newsletter. We do a monthly e-newsletter, and in that e-newsletter, we put links to articles. So we're constantly reading. We're constantly sharing thought leadership. We're sharing research. We're sharing articles. We're highlighting nonprofits. And we get lots of compliments from nonprofit leaders who said, "Oh my God, I'm so glad that article was in the e-news. I shared it with my board." And then, of course, the Sure Impact blog. Sherry and her team are constantly putting out good content, but Board Source for sure. And that Peter Drucker book, I promise you, will be worth the investment. And take the time and thoughtfully go through each of the 5 questions, spread it out over 5 board meetings. One other real quick thing, Sherry, before Q&A, think about your board meetings, everybody. If your board meeting agenda is this, if it's review last month's minutes and approve them, review last month's financial statement, director report, committee report out, old business, new business adjourn. Oh, for the love of God, blow it up. Like, I don't want to go to that meeting. Nobody wants to go to a board meeting where it's just report out, or looking at, what happened last month or last quarter. Board members want to be helpful. So if you restructure your board agenda to allow for strategic discussions, like let's dive into Peter Drucker's question number 1, I promise you, you will get a rich discussion. Board members are going to want to be there. They're going to want to dive in. Again, if you have that old school agenda of report out, we say dialogue, not monologue. You're going to want to move on from that. And it's a strategic decision how to structure a board agenda that hardly anyone spends enough strategic time thinking about, because we're stuck in this rote of how we've always done it.
Yeah, I actually don't have a nonprofit board, but I have a for-profit board, and I've taken your advice and put like all the metrics, the performance metrics that we're using. There's one slide, has all those on there, and then the board agenda is sent out ahead of time, or all the the board deck, all that stuff is sent out ahead of time. It's like
consent agendas. Yep.
Ask me if you have any questions about all the report out.
All the things. That's right.
This is what we're going to discuss in the meeting.
That's right. That's right.
Because if you don't read it, well, then I'm going to get annoyed.
That's right. That's exactly right.
There. But this is really, oh my gosh, this is really fascinating. Well, I'm going to start with Sean's question. But he was curious. And so while we're doing the Q&A, feel free to keep asking your questions, things you're curious about. But Sean wants to know thoughts on regularly going into executive session at board meetings.
Yeah. So again, this is a myth that most people are surprised by. It is considered best practice to have an executive session as a standing line item on the agenda. There are 2 types of executive session. One is where the staff leave except the CEO, right? And the chief executive stays, but every other staff member leaves. And the other executive session is also the chief executive leaves. But there's a cardinal rule with an executive session, and it's this: we are not in middle school. This is not about secrets. This is not about rumors, right? So coming out of executive session, the chief executive is owed a conversation from the board chair to say, hey, this is what was discussed. If executive sessions start becoming secretive, or worse, gossipy, you're going to destroy trust and relationships. And so it's healthy to have candid conversations. And many times an executive session is a way to have a candid conversation, but those conversations should always be collegial, respectful, kind. And the chief executive should know what was discussed. It can be confidential. You don't have to say, well, Sherry wanted to know blah, 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 but no secrets. Yeah, that just creates bad It
People
destroys trust.
trust culture,
Right.
all those things.
Yep.
Laurel, I just had a thought with another resource that Kerri mentioned. Maybe you should also put in the chat the link to get our ultimate guide to impact measurement, just in case anyone on the call is wondering, how do I leverage technology or, measure the right things? So if you wouldn't mind dropping that in the chat. Heather has a great question. What is your take on working boards versus advisory boards? They're at a crossroads and they've been on cruise control for a while, and the board is now needed to step into a more working role to support the one staff person who happens to be the part-time ED.
Oh my goodness. So we could do a whole webinar on that.
Yeah.
So if you only have one staff member, if you only have one paid employee and that position is part-time, then yes, the board has to do more of the work because there aren't enough employees. But please, please remember, the IRS requires you to have a board. So every board is a governing board, right? There are legal duties and ethical duties, duty of care, loyalty, and obedience. So the IRS gives your nonprofit charitable status, tax exempt status, right? You are an EO, meaning you're an exempt organization. And the IRS says, in return for giving you exempt status, you must have a board made up of independent people, independent of business and familial relationships. So that means no husband and wives on the board, no son and daughter on the board, no family, right? No deep business ties, because that could be a conflict. The IRS requires independence of board members. The IRS requires a minimum of 3 board members. We're in the state of Ohio. The state of Ohio requires you to have a president, a secretary, and a treasurer. Other than those simple requirements, you can have as many board members as you want. But please don't abdicate their governing authority because they also have to take on volunteer work because you only have one part-time employee. So every board is a governing board. Some of them have to do more day-to-day work because of the staffing structure. Advisory, so we don't recommend that you have an advisory board. If you want an advisory council, so let's pretend your nonprofit is an education type nonprofit, and you would like to have an advisory council made up of teachers so that those teachers come together, maybe 3 times a year to help inform your program or your outcomes or your work. But don't call advisories boards, because anytime you use that word board, there can be a misunderstanding of what their actual authority is. There's only one board. That's your governing board. That's the board that has legal and ethical authority.
That's great. That's deep and so much great advice.
Yeah.
Something you said in that conversation triggered something that I know I've been asked recently, and that is, one, nonprofits, because they are tax exempt organizations, they are regulated by the IRS, so it's really important that you do adhere to these governance principles, which I think is going to be even more important given the current political climate in the next 4 years. And so we do know that a lot of organizations are faced with either they know they're going to lose funding or they are afraid that they may lose funding.
Yep.
What's going on. So how can the board kind of step in at these times? I've seen a lot of, frankly, what I think is bad advice on LinkedIn recently from people who know nothing about nonprofits or boards and what nonprofits should do right now, but with these cuts. Yep. But I know you know how to help these boards right now dealing with maybe the fear of cuts or the reality of cuts.
Right. And again, maybe sometimes perception is reality, right? There is fear, there's uncertainty. And I think that this uncertainty is adding to the chaos because we can't predict what is going to happen, right? Yeah. So every nonprofit, regardless of what sector you're in, at your next board meeting, I want you to do a couple of things. I want you to have a presentation as to how much of your revenue is coming from the federal, state, county, city, local government. Many times the state dollars or the county dollars are actually passed through federal dollars. So I want you to run a calculation. Remember, I talked about the dependency quotient, which is a measure of risk. I want you to report to your board, what is your level of risk if the federal government completely freezes all spending? What percentage of your budget is at risk? That's number one from the government side. Number two, if the federal government eliminates all of those employees that they're talking about, all the buyouts of staff and shrinking the size of the quote unquote bureaucracy, that might mean less people to process the pay work and the checks that you get. So all of our clients that get a lot of Medicaid dollars, the number one thing that they always say is Medicaid is slow to reimburse, right? If you think Medicaid was slow to pay before, and if 40% of their workforce is now going to be cut, how slow do you think they're going to be able to pay in the coming months? So number one, what is that? What percentage of your revenue is coming from these government sources? Number two, how much of your revenue would be impacted by a delay in timing? Or if you're working with the immigrant and refugee community and they need their TPS status renewed, how many, if the employees can't process that paperwork, what impact is it on you? So one is money, two is people. And then number three, what's your balance sheet? How much cash do you have in reserves? How many months of operations can you sustain if the spigot from the federal government gets turned off? Number four, do you have access to a line of credit? If you need it to dip into a line of credit to manage cash flow, can you? Then number five, how much has your board given? Have they all given? And what can they do to make a special one-time gift in these times? And then number six, what is going to be your fundraising strategy going forward? But you can't start with fundraising strategy. You have to know these other things first, then design your fundraising strategy. Any client, any board who says, all right, what are we doing different on fundraising tomorrow? Before they answer all these other questions is being really short-sighted.
Yeah. What's interesting is one thing you didn't mention is immediately go to cuts.
I wouldn't do that yet.
Yeah.
And the reason I'm saying don't do that yet is I don't want the entire sector to have a knee-jerk reaction and 10 days later have a federal judge halt it, right?
Mhm.
Like this is such an unpredictable time. So I wouldn't do draconian cuts right away. We don't know how all this is going to play out, you guys.
Yeah. Yeah. And
And
it's still needed. So
and the work is still needed. Oh, by
yeah.
the way, your mission is still relevant. I would not resist the fear-based decision of slashing. Again, a federal judge can be issued. You guys, this is like unprecedented territory and it's highly unpredictable. It's highly volatile. So be mindful of what's happening, but don't let fear drive a massive decision. We're going to need to live through this a little bit longer. It's only been 3 weeks.
Yes. Yeah, that's such sound advice. I want to address this question. It sounds like Andrea maybe is their name. They're starting a nonprofit. Should everyone be a board member or should someone be appointed the executive director? Can you function without an executive director?
So, Andrea, I'm going to say this with all love and empathy and sincerity, but do you need to start a nonprofit? And we typically tell folks don't do that. And I say that with pure love and empathy because of why. I don't know the work that you want to do, but typically when someone wants to start a nonprofit, it's because they have a programmatic idea. We can do this for this community or this group of people. Running a program is very different than launching a corporation and running a business. And starting a nonprofit is you first have to have articles of incorporation. You then get tax exempt status from the IRS. You then have to build a board. You then have to hire employees. You have to have policies. You have to have procedures. You have to have funding. Do you really want to launch a business, or do you really want to launch a program? And if what you have is a programmatic idea, my advice is get a fiscal sponsor. So what's a fiscal sponsor? A fiscal sponsor is a current nonprofit, a current 501c3 that you contract with. That 501c3 is already tax exempt. So if you get any gifts or grants towards your programmatic idea, you can run them through that nonprofit so that the donors get a tax deduction. Do that first. Do proof of concept. Test your programmatic idea by working with a fiscal sponsor. Is your idea a good one? Do people need it? Do you get people who want to volunteer? Do you get people who want to donate? If all of those things are true, then go down the road in the future of starting your own nonprofit, but don't start there. This is a very complex time. I wouldn't do that just yet. And if you say to me, well, too late, we've already done it. The most important thing that you have to do is build your board. And rule number 1 is don't put your friends and family on the board. Rule number 2 is don't put your friends and family on the board. And rule number 3 is don't put your friends and family on the board.
Yes, and it looks like Andrea, she started a nonprofit. She's just joined the board with no executive director, and didn't know if they should find one to volunteer or,
Yeah, you need a chief executive, whether that person is paid or volunteer. Someone has to have the authority to operate the organization. The board's authority is governance, strategy, and leadership. The chief executive's responsibility is operations. The chief executive influences how the governance happens, but you have to have someone who has the authority to run the show. Now, again, if you only have one, employee, the board is going to help that person, but you have to have clear lines of delineation.
Yeah. This has been a fascinating conversation. I can tell by the number of people who are still joining us in the very last minute, but unfortunately we are at the top of the hour almost. So I would love to know, and thank you for your kind words, Amy. I would love to know your last parting thoughts that you want everyone to walk away with today.
I think my parting thought is twofold. One, thank you for what you do. Nonprofit organizations are the underpinnings of the fabric of American life, whether it's education or health or social services or the arts. Thank you for your service to the communities in which you operate. Thank you. It's not easy work. Number 2, know that an investment in people is going to pay dividends. And investing in your board, investing in your chief executive is going to be the most important work that you do. And I'll show this quote here, right? Nothing's more important than the people on your board. Invest in the people, and thank you for the work that you do.
Well, thank you, Kerri, so much. Yeah, feel free to show that slide, how people can connect with you. If you want to learn more, again, I highly recommend the Mollard Consulting Group's newsletter. It's filled with tons of information. Kerri does an amazing work with board governance, so please reach out to her and her team, see how they can help. Sure Impact, we're here to help you if we can help you automate how you measure and communicate your impact, so you have those real-time insights at your fingertips to guide board direction in board operations. We will be sending out the recording and the slides and these resources to you as a follow-up. But thank you so much for joining today, and I hope you have a wonderful week.
Yeah, and don't hesitate to shoot me a question. If any of this is new to you or you have a question, happy to answer them. Thanks, Sherry. Thanks, Laurel. Thanks to everyone at the Sure Impact team.
Thank you very much.